Here is Noodler's Polar Brown, a brown ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
This is an aggressive brown ink that can be seen in the chromatography. It also has a bit of a red lean that comes through more on toned papers, especially the yellow Rhodia at the end of the video. Now there is some tone variation as the pen and paper changes, and this doesn't really shade very much. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performed well enough to be able to be happily usable. It's very serviceable. The ink isn't really made for me. I live in Florida, which is good because this ink isn't a brown that I would be going for. This really feels like it's missing the mark as a brown ink.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Singularity with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We have a lighter brown that is slightly red leaning, that doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does have a little bit of shading that does occur. You see it in Elven King on the first line or third line, where the top of the E is darker than the bottom of the E. It stays lighter through the LV. The EN King at the end does get that tiny bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding. We can see the ink gets deeper into the page, but you could probably write back here with no real problems.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Noodler's Polar Black. Here is Noodler's Polar Brown. Here is Noodler's Polar Purple. Here is Noodler's Polar Blue.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
The tone we're getting is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, and I'm not seeing the red lean that was a little bit there with the Clairfontaine. It's really coming across as a light khaki brown, and not too bad. I think this is one of the better looks we're going to get with this ink. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, which really made me happy considering I know this is aggressive. There's even a couple of moments of shading that do occur. Take a look at the dwarves on the first line, where the TH is darker than the E at the end of the. Now, dwarves starts darker at the beginning of the beginning of the D, lightens up into the WA, but the R, tiny bit darker, VE, a little bit lighter, S at the end, a little bit darker again. So it does do a tiny bit of shading here. Looking at the back of the page, we see there's a minimal amount of ghosting. Not bad at all, considering this is an aggressive ink. Nothing bled through to the page underneath, making this a good paper to be using this ink on.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we're getting here is a kind of, I see more of the red lean, but it's still brown. It's not, it's showing much more of the red than the Clairfontaine did, and it's definitely not as enjoyable as we saw on the Portage. Now, we're not getting very much for feathering, though it is there when you look at the end of Advantage or Numbers, both on the first line. It's not spreading, which is a great thing, and there is even enough shading that you can spot it when you look at enough on the second line, where the EN is a little bit darker than the OUG, but the H at the end gets quite a bit darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we can see how aggressive this ink is. Almost a full read through on the back, so tons of ghosting. No, you cannot take notes back here, but no, it did not touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
The lighter tone that this ink gives doesn't do it any favors against the quad rule. Now, it does stand out against the quad rule, but not very well. It is the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It's got a couple of light moments of shading, but for the most part, not really. I'm going to say it shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine. When I say there are some spots on the third line on Burned, it's the R and the E you can see a little bit of shading through. And on Thoughts, it's the G right in the middle. But mostly, this is one tone in most all of the writing. Looking at the back of the page, I'm pointing to a couple of spots where I can see the ink is deeper into the paper. This paper normally never has this problem, but it is here where you can see the ink getting deeper in there because it's an aggressive ink. Now, it didn't bleed through to the page underneath, and I don't think what's happening is bad enough that you would not write back here because it's not fully ghosting. So it's the couple of spots. It would just bother me, just being a bit crazy about some of that stuff.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Noodler's Rome Burning.
Here is Noodler's Walnut.
Here is Noodler's Banker's Tan. Here is Noodler's Chisholm Trail.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone we're getting on the page is lighter, flatter, and as compared to the Clairfontaine. This is really questionable about what it is that the student was writing with when we're seeing it. Although I do see some red tones coming through, so I guess you could call it but I really don't like this tone. I think this is bad on this paper, but so be it. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, which is great news for it. And there even is some shading silently coming through, like silently on the third line, where the SI is lighter than the L that darkened up a little bit. It lightened into the ENTL, but the Y at the end became darker again. Looking at the back of the page, I'm not sure how well this is going to come through, but I see how deep this ink is in this paper, and I'm pointing to some of these areas now. Now, it did not bleed through and touch the page underneath. It's not fully ghosting. I think you probably could write back here, but this is deeper and more noticeable than we normally get with this paper.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Zenzoi Sweet Pink.
Here is Noodler's Zvago.
Here is Califolio Inti. Here is Diamine Registrar's Blue Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
So the tone we get here is just a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. This is some of the better writing that we have with this ink. So it seems like the Polar inks might actually do fairly well for the 20-pound copy paper. There's almost no feathering. The spread is almost none. The shading, there's a couple of spots that do shade. I think what we're getting here is really the match that Polar inks need. They are really needing drier writing, finer pens, crappy paper. Maybe that's what they're entirely made for. I don't know. I'm not trying to foresee what the pen part would be, but this is really good. I'm impressed. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, you see that sure, the ink gets deep into the paper, but it is not doing nearly as bad as it did on the last two. It's doing fairly good. I couldn't write back here. I wouldn't write back here. It didn't bleed through to the page underneath, but this is really manageable with what's happening considering the paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Mnemosyne Singularity has a dry writing fine nib, and that worked better than my experience in the past with these polar inks. Now, off camera, I used a medium flow broad, and the problems of the past polar inks returned. So, things to keep in mind. I just think that the antifreeze component of this ink, or of the polar inks, really has them needing to be in drier, finer pens, or you're going to get some aggressive results.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.